Hey people. Can someone hear me? Holy crap. Hello back. Yes, now it works. Sorry for the small problems. I'm back now. So I can see there are 9 watchers. I will share my screen. So, okay. Here we are. It's complicated. Holy shit. So can you see the screen? I'm sorry, you can't hear anything. You can't talk. That's problematic. How can I do that? Do you have any idea? Holy crap. I I should be able to invite someone or what? $15. So I will try to invite people. Sorry for that. Shit. I can't invite people or what? Um, Holy crap. That's not a team. I don't know how we could invite all the people. Shit. I'm lost. It's funny that I can just see myself. And the latency, is the latency high? Did you hear something right now? Okay, I think I should start now. But I don't know if anyone will be able to understand anything, or if I can have any feedback. You know what? We will use HipChat. We will use HipChat for latency. Okay. Perfect. So I have a question to verify the latency. It's very hard, but can you answer yes if you hear me right now? Okay, there is like 10-second latency maybe. Okay. So sorry for all this. We will start endly, finally. So we will talk about DDD, domain-driven design, cqrs. Sorry. Common query responsibility segregation, and event sourcing, with the event like domain events sourcing. So the idea behind DDD, maybe a lot of people got it already. So there is a lot of latency. I'm sorry. It took at least 15 seconds to answer. It's to code like the client talks. It's part of it. In fact, DDD, I think, contains a lot of different stuff, which I'm not aware of everything. But one of the parts, and it's an important part, and we will talk about it today, it's ubiquitous language. It's the idea to talk like the client talks, or at least to have the same vocabulary. Um, and by the way, can you see my screen sharing? Just another question. Otherwise, we will. You have the slides, and you can see the slides on your side. I hope it's not too boring. Otherwise, tell me, and don't hesitate to ask question on HipChat. Okay, so Oleg tries to says me I will try to be detailed and consistent. I hope, because I get lost quite quickly. So the ubiquitous language we were talking about is the idea that we share the same vocabulary, and we have to stick with the same vocabulary. So you discuss with your client, and you have ideas about entities you will use or you will design to have in order to implement its thing. But you implement the domain using names like customer or client or user, while the client says totally something different, like he says customer and you say user. And this simple thing is about the ubiquitous language. It's to use the same vocabulary, or at least according on the same vocabulary. Which is why it could quickly become a mess, but because the client says every time it says something, it's messy. We all know that. So when you implement something, most of the time we use doctrine, for example, and doctrine has a few events. He uses post persist and post update, and he uses the term entity. And you don't have to stick with this vocabulary or to stick with these only 6 events like pre-persist, post-persist, post-flush, and everything, because the client doesn't talk like that. The client doesn't say new PDF entity, create an object and persist it. The client prefers to say when I receive a payment, generate the invoice or send the invoice. It will use a more natural language, and so should we. So we should. So that's why we should use the same vocabulary. So another part of domain-driven design, even if it's not really the same thing, is like we could use CRUD operations every time we have to do that. Finally, computing is about handling information, manipulating information, and information we create it or we update it or something. In fact, we always create new information, but we use the terms create, retrieve, update, delete, and we can do everything with that, because at the end we always create information and we update it, and it's a very low-level way of seeing things. You could, instead of everything is handled via create, retrieve, update, and delete an entity, you can have tasks which are very specific for one update or one creation of data or one deletion of data, but each action has its own noun and vocabulary, for example. And for example, we will concentrate on the right side. So it's about what tasks are made for writing, So it's C, U, and D part of CRUD operations. So what's every time you create, update, or delete an entity, in fact, what you do is modify the state of your application, and it is the right side. So, for example, the example we took about before is about receive a payment. So you receive a payment. Even this example is not precise enough because you don't know who received the payment and everything. But let's take this example. So receive a payment should be a command. So you say, okay, do this stuff with my command. For example, my command is receive an event. It could be also delete a user or everything. So this is the command. This is the task you should do on the application to modify it. So the command is a simple DTO object that contains all the information needed to modify the state of the application. And this information, the information that is needed to modify the state, can come from everywhere. It can come from the request using Symfony form object. You handle the form, you submit it, and you get the data once it is valid. And this data is used to populate the command and to give it to the system, the domain part of our application. So it's a layer more than what we do usually, or it could be. And these commands are handled by a command handler, it's named. We will see later that maybe it's not that mandatory. We can make write and read separation without having commands and command handlers. But anyway, this DTO, this plain old PHP object, which contain enough information to modify the state, it's given to a command handler, and it's kind of an entry point in our domain. So the good part of this is that the command handler is framework agnostic, so you don't have to know that there is a form behind and this form is Symfony based and everything. And in fact, the exact same command can be created via CLI, so a command application, or via a form and web-based UI, and you got it. And the controller, the typical Symfony controller, is just here to create a command object and to give it to the command bus, which will give it to the command handler. So what does a command handler is to retrieve the model instance, and it will call everything needed to modify it. So it can be seen it's a service that receives the data, finds the object, like an entity, a doctrine entity, or everything, and calls method on it, and that's it. So it's finally not that complicated, and this command handler contains everything we need to modify the state for this exact use case, which is named receive payment. So now we can see finally what we do is create a command in order to give it to a command handler in order to call a method on an object. We could maybe simplify all this stuff and simply call the command, simply call the method of the object, so retrieve the object and call the method on object directly in a controller. It's not mandatory to have command handler and everything and a command bus, because you already do cqrs if you have a command and a query separation. You don't have to have command objects. At least you do cqs, which is a command query separation, which is already a very important part, which could help to simplify our maintainability of the application. So, for example, you don't need to start implementing this ID. You don't need a very complicated structure and everything, something you don't understand. You can already do that with good old controllers, but calls methods that write only when you write only, and calls methods that read only when you read only, and on separate models. So it's genius, huh? It's write model, just write. And the idea is to separate persistence, but also to separate the complexity of writing with the complexity of reading, because most of the time you have different needs when you read and when you write. So cqrs is typically the idea that you should separate the way you write from the way you read. And the segregation means, so it's coming from a older principle, which is CQS, which is common query separation, which says you should not have methods on an object, for example, that writes and returns something. So for every time you modify an object, you have a method that modifies something. It shouldn't return a value. That's already something. And you should have methods that just write and methods that should just read. Like get user get groups, for example, return something but doesn't modify anything. But user change email, for example, does something, so it shouldn't return something. And cqrs goes a step further, saying the same object should not be used for writing and reading. You have two separate objects and two separate models to write and to read. You don't have to separate persistence, but you can. And we will see later that it can help a lot. But at least you should separate the idea of writing and reading. So we go back to our to our command handlers and command. I just wrote a simple. I tried to write a simple example. So, for example, imagine our controller creates an object based on the request. So we have a form, we have a view, everything. This controller and the view is just the glue to have, which is Symfony specific and everything, to get the data, which is, for example, the amount of the payment and to which client it comes from, for example. And we create this object in our controller. We say new receive payment command, and we give him $request from amount and $request from client ID, for example. And we give it somehow to a command handler. This command handler will contain everything to retrieve the correct object and to call the method that will modify the state. So this receive payment command handler, for example, needs a repository to find the correct object, and finds it using the client ID coming from the command, and then once he have it, so client, he calls a method on it. Client pay, I don't know, $command amount. So the benefit of it is like the command handler does not have anything to do with Symfony, and you separate. You can use I don't know, Laravel if you want and call this command, or you can call Symfony and call this command and everything you want. So the domain part, the layer, is separate from the framework. We can change your framework. It will never happen, but who knows? What you don't know yet is that you can have a REST API, and you can have a web API, and somehow later you will have a CLI API or CLI interface, and you don't know it yet. So a command is always agnostic, and there is no problem with it. It's coupled with the repository, for example, which is coming from Doctrine or something else. So once you do that, you created your command and your command handler. Everything's okay, and then you can go on you can model your domain entities and aggregates. For example, here I have a client object. The client is the one who represents my client, and it's a client has many, for example, has many invoices, let's say, and he has many different things. And the only way to modify something that is owned by a client, let's say, it's to pass by the client itself. So, for example, you shouldn't be able to modify an invoice if you don't get this invoice from the client itself. So the client itself encapsulates everything that needs to be consistent with this client. So it's it has a name in DDD, and I don't remember it. But it's a way to keep consistency inside your domain. If you have access to objects that are related to a client, but you are able to modify it from the outside, you can't guarantee that this object will be consistent with the client, for example. So if you can retrieve an invoice object and modify the amount with a setter, for example, you allow others developers, or if you others guys or other programs to make incompatibilities in your domain. That's something you shouldn't allow. So this client, for example, is the only way, it's the main entry point in your domain, and it's called an aggregate root, because you have an aggregation of objects. You have the entry point, which is a root, and you have many children, which are, for example, the invoices or the groups in which the user is, stuff like that. And that's why you can keep consistency inside your domain model, because the only way you access it is via the root of your aggregates. I hope it's not too abstract, and we often do that already with Doctrine, for example. The only problem with Doctrine is that it allows to access entities from the outside. So the next thing is to try to keep encapsulation, and this is another way to keep consistency inside your domain, is to provide a public API on your aggregate root that you can't modify everything. If you have one setter for each property of your object, like we do usually with Doctrine, because we have a helper tool that say generate setters and getters, and the form object will need to have setters in order to modify your thing, but you can avoid it. Anyway, just because Doctrine and form forces us a bit to have setters doesn't mean we should do it. We should instead have only a few methods that modify the object, and these methods should say something that talks to the client and that that represent all the change. For example, so this is named, finally it's named encapsulation. Encapsulation is a object oriented term that say only the object knows its internals. So object mixes behavior and data, and the only way to change the data inside this this object is by the object itself. And if you have setters everywhere, everyone can change the internal state of the object in a totally inconsistent way. So we can call one setter but forget to call the other one, like set email, and then you forgot to set last updated at, for example, let's set updated at. That's the idea of encapsulation, is like you should modify the data only inside the object itself. And you can do that with appropriate method naming, and the method that does not just modify one property. So the naming of the methods can be important. Remember the vocabulary we talked about, the ubiquitous language. It's the idea to keep the vocabulary inside the same that the client uses. And imagine you want to change the address of someone, where someone lives. So you will say move house, which means déménager in English, in French. And you won't say set number, set street, set country, set postal code, zip code, and everything. So you should encapsulate all these things inside one method that says move house. You give him the new address, for example, as an argument, and internally this method will modify the number property, the street property, the country property. So now we will see. Well, maybe I have an example because it's very abstract, all this shit. So here we call the client pay method, for example, and this pay method does a lot of stuff. So we should have, or maybe I have another example, because I only made a shop example. So imagine we have a product. A product has just concentrate on the internal data currently. It's an ID, okay, a name. It has attributes and a created at and maybe an updated at property. So let's add it. It has an updated at. So now, every time we change something, we should. And this is useless, by the way. Every time we add, we change something, we should modify the updated at. So let's do it simply like that. It's maybe a bad example, but this is encapsulation finally, because you could have one setter for the name and one setter for updated at, and call the same consecutively. But what you should do is it be a method that same rename and that makes the both in one row inside internally. And it can be very more complicated, but the idea is here is to have a method that say something and that does everything internally. So that's how you should. The only setters you should have, it's not setters. Finally, it's methods that have a behavior and that contains that encapsulates the modification of the state. So this is one example. Maybe it's not the best, but it's a simple one. So now it's good. We make changes, but sometimes changes have consequences. And for example, every time you pay, every time a client pays, we should generate a PDF which contains the invoice and send him by email or something. So how to do that? We should use events. Maybe we can use events, but the idea here is to take advantage of events inside our domain model. So it's part of the domain model, and it's not just pre-persist, post-persist, which are totally technical and related to doctrine. The events we are talking about are agnostic, framework agnostic, and they are not related to persistence. It's related to the behavior of our object. It's a consequence of the changes of our domain model. So you don't use post-update or post-persist, because what we do is always persist information. We always store information. It's very low level. It's like to say that when you talk, finally you just throw air outside of your mouth. Yes, okay, maybe bad example, but it's too generic. You can't just use that to represent the needs by your client of the client. So instead of saying post update, you should use the exact same name that the client uses, which is customer moved house. So every time a guy changes his house or goes in a new address, you raise an event that say, okay, once I moved my client, I call the method move house. I raise an event that say customer moved house, and this event contains every information needed to know what happens. For example, it could store the old address and the new address, or just the new address because you don't care about the old address, for example. You can say in the event stores data internally. You can have the client ID and the new address, or the date in which it happened, or the reason why, for example, and stuff like that. So now you have events. We can see how it looks like. So here, for example, inside our domain model, this object looks like a bit doctrine. In just the difference is like instead of being handled by doctrine, it's handled by something else. So we don't have the column properties and everything because it's not stored inside columns. But anyway, a doctrine entity is nothing else than a plain old PHP object, and this one is too. So when we rename something, when we rename this object, we do our stuff, and we emit an event saying this happened. Indeed, my product has been renamed, for example. And you store inside the data that is needed to know what is a new name, for example. You can have more complicated events, and you can have every name you want. Here, example, I have just renamed and new attribute, but you get it. You could have a lot of different stuff, and you emit this event. What it does currently is nothing. This emit, in fact, doesn't raises events inside the outside of it. It just stores it inside itself in the events array of the object itself, and we will see later how it's handled. But this is more technical. So now you have events. So your domain model raises domain events, and these events say a lot of things already. and the client can understand them. It's not just post persist of instance of address entity or client entity. By the name, you already know what happened. So the client understands them, so do you, and so it eases maintainability and evolution of your application. You can add more behavior based on an event later without modifying existing code. So it's open-closed principle, maybe. So events are past tense and they are declarative. It's just saying what happened. You can't change the facts. I indeed renamed my product. It's a fact. It's done. So it's in past tense, and it's not meant to be like a method call or anything. It's just a fact saying, hey, this happened. So it's declarative. Payment received is an example. Customer moved is an example. Or payment or product renamed is another example. But it's very hard to have a good events name, and that's apparently, even if I didn't do that very often, but it's hard to find good event name and events that don't just say product changed, because if you do that, you will continue to make CRUD operation. It's the U part of CRUD. You just say, okay, something changed, product changed, but you don't know what. It doesn't say anything finally, because everything changes. If there is an event, it means everything changed. So why saying it? You know it already. You'd better find an even better name, and you do that again with the ubiquitous language by doing event stormings. It's the idea to go meet in a place with your client and every actor involved in the project, and using post-its saying, making flows of operation of the domain. So the domain experts or the product owner says, okay, what happens is I make a service for this client. This client pays, payment is received, and his invoice is sent, and then once invoice is received, I close the contract or something. And you make flows of operation like that. And this, from that, gets out some event names you can use directly in your code. And something else that comes out from these meetings is method names, maybe. So, and also the domain model. You will name your objects like they are named on these post-its. That's theory. So once you have these events, you can do something with it, and you don't have to hard code everything in one place. For example, in the controller, you get the object, you call the method on it, and once it's done, you get the mailer and send an email. All of this inside the controller. And if you want to do something else, you will modify this controller. Instead, what you can do is use listeners that listen domain events. So every time you persist your domain model, like for example the product object we saw before. Wait. Here. So here, for example, I will show you an example. Change product. Here we get a product. So we find the product using its ID, and we rename it. So here we rename it 1,000 times. Yes, I think event storming can be done maybe multiple times. I don't have any experience in it. I just heard about it, finally, mainly from Matthias Veres, which knows far more than I do. I'm just explaining ideas that I understood, but it can be done maybe multiple times. In fact, it's a very iterative way of doing things. It's based on the idea that the more use case you have, and use cases come later in the future, the more refactoring you will do, and you will find new events. So it's very iterative. I think you can do event storming many times, but indeed, it's maybe before implementing the use case you will implement later, and which means not only inside the backlog, but on every iteration of or every sprint or stuff like that. So here we rename the thing and we save the object. And once we save it, it will raise all the events that happened inside itself in the correct order. Even maybe it's not important. Sure, it is. Order of events is maybe important, so it will raise events in the order in which it happened. And what it does, once you have raised your events during the store, the save stuff, it's like a post flush in Doctrine. So everything is good, you save your object, now you can do stuff with it. For example, generate a PDF, broadcast the updates via WebSockets, and make async operation like encoding videos or whatever. But you can do many things later on if you want. So that's good. We just for the moment we just created information, stored information, but we didn't display it, which is not really helpful. Even if because most of the application usage is about reading. Or in our day-to-day life, we have 90% of reads and 10% writes. So we should focus on reads. And we all know that Doctrine, as soon as you want to do heavy stuff, hydration is slow, and using the same domain model that you use to write with the read will increase big time the length or the size of your classes, of your entities, because you will have a lot of different methods. Get clients by year, get get whatever, and inside this method you will have update product, rename product, and stuff like that. So we know that sometimes reading with Doctrine and entities can be slow and can be frustrating and you have to use DQL, which doesn't do whatever all that you want, and you have to hydrate entities, but you have a count property in your listing. You want to know how many comments are inside. How do you do that with Doctrine? You end up with extra fields inside your result set, which doesn't map to any property of your entity, and you end up with bad stuff at the end. You will have a row which contains the aggregated values like the count, the sum, and you will end up with the entity itself, and you have 100 rows of that, and it's very slow, and it can be complicated. So you should maybe consider having a separate model for your reads, and that is cqrs. That's part of the query separation or segregation. So how could we have a separate read models? Well, we already what we've done before already helps. We have domain events and we have event listeners. So why not use them to make a separate read model? That's the idea. and you can even optimize it and denormalize it. So for example, you have a very complex screen. You have a screen that is just listing stuff, so for example, statistics of the users, how many comments per day they do. You can do that in DQL, but you will have hard time. What you could do is make a separate table that is totally read-only and that contains per line the aggregated value of the number of comments, for example. And you don't have to make complicated queries, because it's you just have to select star from this table, and you will display it in a simple HTML file. And you don't have DQL entities and everything. Well, you can if you want, but you have a separate thing, so you can customize it without messing up what you already done with the right side and adding columns on something, and you don't have to deal with it. And how to do that? Well, simply implement a new listener, the same as you made for generating a PDF once the invoice, once the payment is received, for example. And it ends up with projection of what happened. And for example, the payment is received, so you will update the payment view side. And you can also, in the meantime, on the same event, update another projection. So you can have multiple projections of the same data. And you can have one in MongoDB, one in SQL, and whatever you want. And so how does it look like? So I'm already at the end of my talk, and I have to fill it. So how does it look like? For example, you can have a projection which is here. We have some object here that subscribe to the domain events. So it's an event subscriber, and we name it RDBM projector. In fact, it's not a good name, but it makes a projection of a product. So we subscribe to those domain events, product created and product renamed. So every time a product is created, here we receive the event that happened, and inside we will create, or we will add a row inside the product table. But we could do that in SQL, in MongoDB, you got it. And it's very a simple example, but it shows you the idea. And so every time the event product created is raised, we insert a row inside the product table, and we just put the created at, the name. We should add the category and stuff like that, and that's it. And the read side of our application, so we will have a controller inside Symfony that say list products for a given category. And what it does, it will not use the product entity that we saw before. It will use the product table here. That is totally different and independent. And it will simply say select star from where category star category equal something. So you will tell me, of course, we can do that with Doctrine already. It's not that complicated, but you will have use cases where as soon as you have complex DQL operation, and as soon as you have to tweak your Doctrine entity because of the read side, and it happens quite fast, you would like to have this, maybe. So it asks a lot of maintenance, maybe. As soon as you modify a property, you will have to add it inside the projection or the listener that create projection. So it can be intensive or time consuming to maintain those projections, but we will see maybe later that it can help also a lot to have idea of events and projections. So another thing here, once we renamed a product, we will simply find the product which is about and update the name, and we can have many different stuff like that. One of these listeners could be generate PDF or whatever, or update the video and stuff like that. So this is an example of projection. So now we go to the last part. Maybe I've gone too fast. If you have question, tell me. I hope I answered all the questions. So event sourcing is the idea. Wait, I'm not sure. Everybody. So event sourcing is the idea to store. It's very a simple idea. So we have domain events that are raised, and what we do is simply store them in the order it appeared, and we will store them with the origin of the aggregate root where it comes from. So in our example, the product ID or the client ID, and we will store also the class from which it comes from. That's the technical detail, but it will help us later. And event sourcing is it's the idea to store the events. We simply serialize the events and store them inside whatever you want. MongoDB is a good example, because once it's serialized in JSON, for example, you just put them as a document inside MongoDB, and it works quite well. And that's why inside our models, I have annotations which says how to serialize something, how to serialize properties, and inside the events itself, you can have serializable properties, or you can implement serializable, and based on the store, it will use one or the other strategy. It's up to you to configure how you want to store your data and your events, and based on that, it will use the correct annotation or the correct way of serialize. But it's a complicated stuff to serialize objects and retrieve them later, and ORMs do that very well finally. So it's not necessary to make event sourcing. It's not necessary to use these events in a way to rebuild objects later, that we will see. But you can use event sourcing just to have an audit log. Finally, it's not a new idea. A lot of applications have an audit log that just store what happened, and it's enough. It's already a lot of information. Most of the time you won't need it, but you could need it, and we will see later how we could very usefully use them. So ORM do that very well. It's a way finally to serialize the state of an object and retrieve it later. That's exactly what it is about. But most of the time it doesn't help to separate read from writes. You can only have one entity per table in Doctrine. Well, you can have many of them, but the doctrine schema update will scream if you want to use it, because it's not meant to do that. One entity, one table, write and read mixed together. That's the idea. Well, if you use object hydration and everything. So ORM can be very good, but we will see how we can use event sourcing to persist objects by themselves. So in fact, it's killing two birds with one stone. You already have domain events because it helps, because it simplifies your life. It permits extensibility, open-close principle maybe. Maybe it's wrong usage of this term. So you already have domain events. You already have listeners that does stuff, heavy stuff, without blocking the request. And you can kill the second bird by replaying events. So you have these events. They are stored. They are append every time. It's an append only store. So you will never delete an event because it's done. It's past. You renamed your product, and it's true. It will stay true for the rest of your life. But maybe you will update it later, but then it's a new information, and you still renamed it a week ago, but you renamed it a week later, and you know it. And events are a way to to store the past, and you can replay those events to get to a given state of your application, and that is a very powerful idea, even if no one will use it maybe. But you can use it as a persistence layer, because you can reconstruct your objects at a given time, which most of the time will be the last time it changed, because we don't want to modify objects from last week. Well, we could, but most of the time we don't. We don't care. We will replay the events until the last one every time, most of the time. But it's a way to replay and reconstruct an object. In an ORM, what we have is a line in a table that contains the current state of the object, and we will map every of these columns inside the property of the object, and we have our object back. And every time it changes, we override the columns that change inside the row, and we have the same row which is updated. With event sourcing, what we do is we replay the events from the first one to the last one on the object itself, and we will see how it makes that. So you create, like Doctrine does finally, you create an empty instance using reflection or deserialization, and you call the exact same method that you called precedently, and if you do that in the correct order with the correct data, you will have your object at the exact same state it was before, and no problem. The only thing is that you will replay events that will be overridden later by another event maybe, so it's a bit useless to replay all the events, but you can't do differently. Well, you can if you use snapshots, but most of the time you don't have to. Remember that right side is only 10% of the time, and you can, having hundreds of events will not kill your CPU or whatever. It's maybe less expensive than talking or making hydration and one-to-many relations and shit like that. So it's not that expensive. And that's all, folks. So we will see how we can do that. Oops. So it's a way to persist our objects, and we'll see how our product here can be replayed to a given state. So one implementation which is possible is to have one method for each event that exists, and you will apply it on the object itself, which means each object which is replayable has a function which is apply event name, or for example apply product created. It receives the event that is retrieved from the event store, and it uses the event to put its current state. For example, the name equal event name, or product renamed is the same. Renamed. And product created has a little bit more information. It has the attributes, for example, apply product created. It has the ID of the object. It has the name, if it's mandatory. You see the thing. It has attributes, and so you can do that like that. But you can also use the public API of your object directly, because finally, well, it's a way to do that. The way with apply methods is a lot used in some implementation of event sourcing, like Beverley, like cqrs, and others. But you can use the exact same methods that were called that generated the events, and you developer know exactly which methods have emitted which events, and you can map them using an array here that say the event product created give all the attributes of these events to the construct method, and give all the attributes or the data of the attribute added event to the add attribute method. And interesting thing is that you will have the same method, so your controllers or your command handlers will call the method. So you as a developer will call add attribute, give him the attribute, but the event store engine behind the scene, if you want to get back your product instance to the given state, it will also call add attribute as many times as needed, as many times as there are events. So if you call 10 times, if you have 10 times attribute added events, this add attribute will be called 10 times. And rename, same thing. So you rename your product twice. There are two events that comes out of the event store, and rename will be called 2 times. One with the first renaming, and second time with the second renaming. That's the idea about event sourcing. And that's how you can store objects without any ORM and without tables, or good old tables that we know of. And it's another way of persist information. It's persist consequences of the behavior of your objects. It's an interesting thing because you don't have the impedance mismatch, which is that relational data does not fit well with object-oriented programming. It's two different paradigms. It's a different way of seeing data, and there are different kind of problems with ORM. By its very nature, it's not very compatible. And using this kind of persistence, you don't have compatibility problems because you store what objects are doing. So it will totally fit the object paradigms. In fact, one of the object-oriented design is to see objects messaging to get in between using messages, and these messages are calling a method with the data, and they communicate each other, and it's a way to see messaging between objects using the public API. And that's exactly what we do. So we are in the object-oriented paradigm by storing events. Then the problem is to serialize events in a performant manner. We can use PHP serialize, it's fast. We can use binary serialize, it may be faster. We can use JSON. We can use a lot of different things and store them. There are different strategies to store them. And most of the time, when I thought about it, I find myself that I have a very deep usage. I'm very used to relations between objects because of the ORM. But remember that what we store are just events that permit to reconstruct the object and permit to create projections. And we don't have to store the whole graph of objects, because most of the time, remember that objects that we are talking about, that we persist, are just the right side. And right side doesn't need to get all the relations, the objects related to another object. It just, most of the time, it needs an ID, just an ID of which user, for example, it is. It doesn't need the user object, it needs the user ID. If you need some other information, just store it as a scalar value, but don't store a whole object every time, because you will end up with massive events, and those events will be slow to serialize and deserialize. That's why it's important to store the minimum information needed by an object to be reconstructed and to create projections. So that's about it. DDD, it's an abstract idea of naming things correctly, and many other, and aggregate roots, keeping consistent objects with correct method that encapsulate modification. cqrs, the idea to separate read from write with two separate objects and two separate tables if you want. And event sourcing, which is simply what I explained. So I saw that maybe indeed we should discuss. The problem is, how could we do that to discuss, because Hangout will not store, because Hangout doesn't allow us to discuss. Or can you talk on the Hangout? So I hope I was not too abstract, and I hope it was interesting at least. Wait, I'll try. I'll try the hangout. I don't know what happens. Oops. Oh, what's happening? No, I can't hear you. With Chrome.
And now?
And no, I can. Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. With a bit of latency.
Okay. Great. So we can start the discussion.
Yeah, with pleasure. Yeah, it's a very interesting part, and it's totally non-technical. It's more about sharing ideas with the client, event storming, and finally domain events and everything. It's not technical.
I have a question about did you already have the successful implementation and production usage of event sourcing?
Using event sourcing, no, but using domain events, yes. I used some events from the KNP-RAD bundle implementation. For example, to send emails once something has changed inside the domain, without using post-persist and pre-persist listeners. But that's all, unfortunately.
More, as I am following this same in the internet, there are a lot of mentioning about it, and a lot of different presentation or articles, but yes, there's no real use case about how to use it. And as is mentioned, it is like it Flo is discussed. So it's kind of good to have, but no one use it. So as what's interesting, even big companies which have a big R&D department didn't have some implementation. So
yeah, it's true.
It's bit weird why it's not yet.
Yeah, it's true. It's the idea is not new, but there is not a lot of documentation on DDD cqrs, and when you go on the forum or the Google group DDD/cqrs or something, there are some forums and discussions. It's interesting, but it's very abstract. Every time it looks like people are too smart to discuss about it. They always say, "Yeah, of course, no, and they are totally not precise, and there is no example of implementation. And yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah, because I'm trying to find some real case. Some usual implementations for some moment when you can take it and say yes, it's okay, it's a cool moment. So it's kind of what I'm a bit falling into other scope. It's about polymer when you're trying to create almost custom tags, and I'm also trying to find implementation of these things. And one of who started implementation of this polymer custom tags is GitHub. So GitHub, one of the company which use latest technologies, and as following also eventing, I'm not found any at least usual implementation, and this is important because they say yes, it's cool. We have a lot of articles, a lot of discussion about this, and a lot of mentioning in news or live session or conference, but it's weird or confusing why it's not use it in a real project. So maybe we have a chance to be first to do this.
Yeah, right. It gains a lot of popularity, and the guys who named this methodology, so it's mainly Greg Young and Udi Dahan. Those guys say don't use cqrs everywhere. cqrs is misunderstood, and you shouldn't go full cqrs blah 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 every time. And yeah, I think it's a misunderstood idea. It's very hype, and that's what say Udi Dahan. Like, because it's hype, everyone wants to do cqrs, but you don't need it most of the time. So go easy, and I agree we should be careful with that. But as Eve says, it's interesting to see how we could persist different things, and how it helps. And creating a toy project, I think it would have a very high added value, because it would help us to see the limitations of the idea. Because for the moment, the examples are very simple and too basic, and yeah, having a real use case would be awesome. We could do that one of these times if you wish.
Yeah, I had just a little questions about everything like this. So I read many articles about cqrs and yeah, domain driven and everything like this, and I see one little default. I don't know if you agree with me. It's not really dry compliant. It means that you have to repeat yourself. For example, just to create a command in a query, you need to have a read models and write models that will share some kind of line of code or something like this quite often, I mean. And if you do domain driven after this, you will have maybe an inventory domain and I don't know, product domains, for example, that share two different models. One is, I don't know, a user for an inventory and a user for a product that shares code, the same line of codes maybe. So yeah, it's quite, for me it's very complicated to be dry if you do some cqrs and domain driver. What do you think about this?
Yeah, totally. I agree that you will have to repeat yourself a lot, and sometimes it's boring indeed. And people that do that say, okay, every time I have a new use case, I have a simple tool that generates 10 classes for me. And there is a common class, the common handler, the I don't know what, the aggregate root, and the bounded context, what they name it, and they make a lot of classes, and it's a lot of boilerplate. And they will have, yes, the class for representing projections, for making a view of the data, and a new event, or many new events for the use case. So it makes tens of classes, and there is a lot of boilerplate and repetitions. So that's indeed a problem. And but sometimes, yeah, it sounds crazy, but sometimes dry doesn't mean what we think. Dry, as the article of Matthias Veras is very mind-blowing. Dry is about knowledge, and what we think should be put inside one single place of the code. I will give you the link. What we think should be put inside one and only one place is in fact not. So when we say dry, what is dry is the shared behavior or something of something. It's not because a category and a cart in a shop, in an e-commerce shop, for example. It's not because a category of products and a cart both have products inside, does not mean that we should have the same abstract class, for example, to handle product additions, because it's two separate things. You don't handle carts the same way as you handle product categories, but both share the same code to add a product inside. Or
I understand, and this is why we have trait, for example.
Yes, but finally traits, it will also couple the logic. So because imagine in one place your add product method will have some limitations. For example, you can't add 3 products which are toxic inside your cart because it's dangerous to ship. And on the category part, you can. And how do you handle that? You will duplicate the add product method, and you will have a duplication. But it's not dry. It's stay dry because it's two different ways to implement the same thing. Maybe that's the idea behind the article that I linked to you. But I agree. Most of the time you will copy paste things. Yeah,
I don't really agree. You just explained something like I have an interface that I give to my object to associate other ones, and if I made several implementations, I'm not dry. I don't agree. But you can be dry with several implementations of the same methods. That's not the problem.
Yeah,
if
you can.
You just have to maybe to do a trait, because I don't know, 3 objects share the same add product, but the 4th does not. So you just have to implement a trait for the 3 first one, and the 4th you just create it on by hand, and you keep it dry.
Yeah, so, I agree. And but this kind of problems is out of the cqrs problem.
Yeah.
But indeed, it is part of it. but I think the biggest problem is the boilerplate code that is needed to make cqrs. But I agree with you with what you said. It's very heavy to make cqrs. Sometimes we don't need it simply.
Yeah, well, cqrs I'm not sure, but cqrs domain driven, and if you add event sourcing, yeah, it's like a big factor.
Yeah, and you can pick one of these. Just make event sourcing without doing DDD, without using cqrs, or you will have to if you make event sourcing. But you can also have parts of your applications that use cqrs and others that are good old application CRUD ready or something.
Yeah.
You don't have to go full cqrs, I think, and that's what says the guys behind it. Just some parts of your domain are complicated. In that case, maybe it's better to use cqrs. And if you go full cqrs by default, it will sure be an error and a lot of pain.
Yeah, I agree. So, yeah, that's very interesting.
No, I think if you talk about derive in cqrs and event sourcing, it's not a problem, because this is a question about right tool for right things, for these things. It means you're not required to use cqrs when it's not needed or helmet in such place. So it's kind of use helmet hammer not for not for thing for what it created. So if you talk about event sourcing, it should be use it in the right. It's totally right place. It's why we talk about some usual cases where we can really use it and really show that it's if we use cqrs there, you use event sourcing there, it will be much more better than you can use classic solution or classic application. So, and this is one of important moments. So, dry in such cases not be a case ever.
Yeah, I agree. True. You don't have to make cqrs where you don't need it, and you can mix different implementations.
Yeah, other thing is that I think as technology not really use it in or famous in now, because I think when it will be most we have when it have a really good implementation, really good examples of how to use it. I think this technology also have an evolution as well in structure or business logic or construction, how it should be implemented with DDD and others other available patterns in the current programming world. So I think due evolution, it will be also updated about using about derive.
Right. And yeah, the fact that it's not that much used and not very well explained, I think it's very misused, and a lot of posts on the DDD cqrs forum are full of examples of misusing this idea. And I think until it's very well used, and if it's needed, we will have to wait to have good examples of usage. And I think if we go with projects which have which use cqrs, I think we will encounter a lot of problems that we didn't think about at first. But I'd like, personally, to take a try, as Eve says, make a real use case and see how well it goes, and see if all our fears, like David say about dry and complexity, does it worth it? I would like to try, but I don't have a real use case, and for the moment I played a little bit with the idea of event sourcing, and a lot of different frameworks are coming out there, or libraries, from Beverley, like cqrs, or more recently Broadway, like you pointed out, Gauthier. And a lot of them have examples and everything, and it's very interesting to deal with all this kind of stuff, but having real use case would be awesome. So we need use cases, because I only tried with product. I don't know what to write. For me it's simple. I add a product in a cart and basta. But when you go on a client, they always have complicated use cases. It's like hell. I don't know why clients are so complicated, but they have always shitty use cases. And we should find them and try to implement them. Yeah, it would be would be awesome. Well, I'm on a project currently that has a lot of complicated use case finally, and this is the one I used some domain events on it, not just a few of them, but it already helped me to decouple some parts, like hashing password outside of the user entity. Of course, it should be maybe, and stuff like that, or sending email if everything goes well. And I think this project could benefit in some of parts of this. But I would be afraid of refactoring any existing project with this. Even if I think it could be doable. You just replace one controller by a new one, and instead of doing the old way, you do it the cqrs way. Make a command, get the data from the request, handle this command, and raise events and do stuff. Just for one controller, it could be doable, but yeah, I'm afraid to refactor something also. I think we should, with a green project, greenfield project, could be maybe better. And something I didn't explain for the project I currently work on, it's an e-commerce thing, but it has some complex use cases, and something that comes from DDD too, and that's where you see separating writes from reads. Is like sometimes a client can be seen as a customer, sometimes it can be seen as an authenticated visitor of the website, and sometimes it's seen as I don't know, you see what I mean? When you talk about someone, this guy, sometimes this guy is considered a friend, but on another point of view, it's considered a colleague or a worker, and you have different point of view for the same information or same object in real life, and this use case come quite often in our projects already. And this idea is about maybe in DDD it's about bounded context. So the context in which you talk about your entities and everything, and the same entity in Doctrine, for example, is used for everything. So your user is used for authentication, but it's also used for profile editing and also used for in the admin side to edit the permissions of the user, and you have 3 points of views for the same entity. This becomes problematic. You pollute your entity with many unrelated things, and you can't do differently with Doctrine or RAM, but you can if you have different objects that handles different kind of information, and each write model represents the same information. I don't know how we can implement that, but at least you have this. You have more freedom on this way with this problematic. And it's interesting to see how sometimes something that seems complicated finally helps to simplify and, more importantly, help maintainability of the application. Because if you modify the authenticated visitor use case, you won't break the profile use case for the same information, because you won't modify the same class and you won't break anything. So this helps a lot sometimes. I hope you see what I mean. Okay. But all this is very theoretical. I never implemented anything with real cqrs, command handlers, and everything. It's just the idea, and I just wanted to share my thoughts and a bit of my knowledge. The slide I made them yesterday quite quickly. Not really sure about everything I say. But anyway, finally we made the 2 hours was long. I hope it was not too boring, and I hope even more that we could make some use case one of these times. Yeah, Gauthier, yeah, we could. We should try that. Cool, thanks. So let's see if the YouTube video has recorded correctly with all these problems. And Pierre, I want to see you rinsed. You're the next.
And David also, huh?
Yeah, David, yeah. Yeah, David, you forgot about yourself.
And Silas also.
Oh yeah, right. I took time because it was so rainy and cold outside, but yesterday it was warm. So thanks for listening, and I hope we will have time to discuss it more, maybe. Bye.
Okay, bye.
See ya.
Thank you.